Hello, and thank you for watching. This video will serve as an instructional guide on changing the water pump in your 1982 to 1985 Cadillac with an HT4100 engine, just like this 1983 Sedan DeVille. That'll be the subject of today's video. As a note, this will not apply if you have a 1985 Cadillac DeVille or front-wheel drive Fleetwood model. This is only for the older style HT4100 that has these V-belts for the accessory drive. This isn't a hard job to do. It is tedious. There are a lot of components that need to be removed, and there are a few spots where you could make a misstep if you've never done it before. So this video will serve to address those and hopefully help you to do this job yourself. I think that this is a job that an average, somewhat mechanically inclined person can do. Again, it's not difficult, it's just time consuming. So if you have some time and the interest to do it, you can effectuate this repair yourself. And even after purchasing a couple of specialized tools, and I think you'll still be well ahead of paying a shop to do it and potentially having them create more issues than you might have had before. So stay tuned for the steps to achieve this repair of our subject here, the water pump. So the first step in doing this is, of course, getting the radiator shroud out. On a rear-wheel drive car like this, only the top part of the shroud is removable without messing with the radiator, and that's all you need to remove to do this job. So in this case, again, on a rear-wheel drive car, you'll remove these two crossbars here, one on this side and one here. These are all 13 millimeter. These cars are basically all metric at this point, at least for mechanical items. Some body parts are still standard. The fan shrouds themselves, it can depend, if the car's been apart before from the factory. A lot of these were stapled. In this case, there are just 3 bolts on each side to remove. And of course, the power steering reservoir screws to the fan shroud. So once you have the top part loose, there are just 2 screws in here that thread into this reservoir. This reservoir, if you want to tie it off, you definitely don't want to let it drop too low, because then it will leak out the fluid. And again, on a rear-wheel drive car, this doesn't apply to Eldorado or Seville. You just remove this, or move this hose out of the way. I would recommend just removing it from the clamps and not trying to pull the clamps out of the shroud. These are just like plastic, pine tree style retainers that hold it to the shroud, and you'll probably break them if you try to pull it out. With the shroud removed, the next step is to start loosening the accessory drive belts. The first one that we'll tackle here is the air conditioning and power steering pump belt. It's the rearward most belt on the engine. So with the air cleaner off, we can access all the bolts that hold the air conditioning compressor on. We have this top bolt that runs through the compressor. This should just be totally removed when we do this, because this bracket here, which attaches to the thermostat housing, needs to come off anyway. There is a lower bolt. You can see the threaded part just about here. And the bolt head side of it isn't really visible here, but comes into the intake manifold. That should be removed as well, as that will prevent you from removing this bracket, which needs to come off as well. There is a lower rod here with another mount bolt just underneath. It attaches here and has an adjustment at the rear of the AC compressor bracket. This doesn't need to be removed, but it has to be loosened at this point here. that we're looking at now. This other bolt here that holds it to the compressor doesn't really need to be moved, and it's kind of difficult to access as well. The other side of this is, of course, the air conditioning compressor head connections. If you have working air conditioning, you want to definitely treat this with respect. As you can see, this has already been repaired in the past. You do want to loosen this somewhat as the compressor moves fairly significantly, and you don't want to put any undue stress on the connections if you have working air conditioning. So with the air conditioning compressor loose, the next thing we can remove is the alternator. The alternator has to come off of the car. Again, it has numerous bolts. You have the one up here, one at the pivot, at the jack screw location down below. You have one that attaches to the rear as well. It has an adjustment at the exhaust manifold. A little bit hard to see, but the bolt is just down there. There's really no particular order in which to do this. This is just the way that I do it. You do want to make sure that you get the alternator off before you try to loosen the smog pump belt, which is just below it. This is a very, very difficult adjustment to make, and it's almost impossible to do, especially on a rear-wheel drive car like this, with the alternator in, unless you have the car on a lift or something. With the alternator removed, the air pump is much more exposed. The air pump is retained by only 2 screws. You'll have one here and one at the back of it, which is extremely hard to get to. It's made somewhat easier by removing this air supply hose from the pump. As an aside, I should mention it's good to have the battery disconnected while you do this. You don't want to have either of these 2 terminals which connect to the back of the alternator touch any unpainted metal surface, as these are positive. So we can see here, just about in the center of the screen, the rear jack screw and lock screw for the air pump. You do probably need some amalgamation of wobbles and extensions to get to this bolt and to unthread it. The lock bolt is a 15mm, with the jack screw adjuster being a 13mm. Again, it's a very tight squeeze. The air pump doesn't have to come off the car, but it does have to be loosened, obviously, to get the belt off, and the top bolt needs to be removed to remove the alternator bracket. So for the purposes of the video, I just removed the smog pump. This is a bit quicker to do rather than just loosen it. So the smog pump is removed. We can see that the through bolt that held it on goes through this alternator mount bracket here. So that removes one of the bolts holding the bracket on. There is another bolt located here, 15mm, and this nut just here, which mounts to a stud that threads into the engine. So we can see here now, with the alternator bracket removed, you can see more of the water pump, which is retained by that stud. And actually, by removing the bracket, we already created a little bit of a leak of water coming out. Just a word of caution on bracket removal and I guess reinstallation. The long bolt that goes through the bracket threads into aluminum here in the intake manifold. So you want to be a bit ginger when you take it off or put it back on. Make sure you don't cross any threads or strip it out. The other bolt that goes through the smog pump and retains the bracket on this side, this screws into the cylinder head, which is cast iron, so you really don't have to worry too much about stripping that out. So that should basically take care of the passenger side of the engine. Now we'll move over to the driver's side. Now moving to the driver's side of the engine, we can see we have the fan out of the way. The next thing we'll tackle is just the vacuum pump. on top of the power steering here. The vacuum pump doesn't need to be removed, it just needs to be loosened enough to get that belt off. And pretty minor belt, no real load there, so not a lot of tension on it. So we'll get that off, and from there we can begin to pull the power steering pump pulley. So after loosening the three 13mm bolts holding the vacuum pump on, we can get the belts off and begin pulling the power steering pump pulley. You will need a GM power steering pump puller and installer set. You can sometimes rent these from auto parts stores. I have an old K&D one that served me well for a long time. Definitely a worthwhile investment if you're going to be doing your own work. I would also recommend that really on the reinstallation that you coat the power steering pump pulley, where the shaft rides, definitely with some kind of anti-seize or grease that won't be easily washed away. Sometimes these things can be very, very stubborn to get off, and you don't want to, if you do have to remove this, they have somewhat of a service life of how many times they can be pushed on and pulled off. If you do have to do this again, you really don't want to put any undue stress on those pulling jaws that are on the pulley. I would also say that if you have maybe a later service replacement pump pulley, those sometimes have holes in them that will allow you to access the bolts that are behind it. This is an original power steering pump pulley, so it has no access holes for that. But in most cases, you're going to have to take this off, and this can be difficult. Like I said, you really don't want to damage this pulley. It is an HT4100-82-85 specific part. So if you damage it or end up having to cut it off, you're going to have to go find another one in a junkyard and pull that one off. With the power steering pump pulley removed, the final pulley we have to take off is the crank pulley down below. You'll notice that this one has bolts. There are 4 bolts around the perimeter. There's one in the center. In all likelihood, your car will not have this bolt in the center. I added this bolt years ago doing other repairs in which I had to remove the actual crank hub. This pulley is only really retained by these 4 bolts, and it should just be able to be removed. No pulling is required for this one. So with the crank pulley removed, the water pump is now almost completely exposed. The last thing that we'll take off here is just the bracket at the front of the air conditioning compressor, which just has this single bolt on the bottom holding it on, a single nut on the bottom, I should say, holding it on. If you haven't already drained the cooling system, now will be the time to do it. Usually I'll save it till I get up to this point, just because I usually make a mess and rather be aggravated midway through the job than at the beginning. With the last of the bracketry removed, we're basically, I guess, at the water pump proper, if you want to call it that. The only other item to remove here is just the timing mark, which you can see is retained by 2 nuts. So you'll remove those 2 nuts, take the timing mark off. Behind it are 2 more nuts that actually affix the pump itself to the timing cover. The thermostat housing here is a separate part from the water pump, but when you remove it from the remove the pump from the engine, this will come with it. So you have this bolt here that retains it to the timing cover. I have had these break in the past. Sometimes they come out just fine, other times the head snaps off. Not a big deal if it snaps off. It threads into an exposed area of the timing cover, and you could usually get it out easily with vice grips, even if the head breaks off. As I said, this one has been replaced the last time that I did this job. So you have these 3 nuts here, just like I said, behind the timing mark, and one over here that affix the pump to the cover. You'll remove those, and the balance of these bolts here, that you have 2 here, 1 here, 2 on the other side, and that will affix the water pump I guess also to the timing cover. One thing you want to make sure of, from the factory, these had no RTV on them. They just had a gasket. That's usually the way that I put them back, but oftentimes if the pump has been changed by a shop in the past, they will glue them with RTV to the timing cover. If you're not interested in pulling the timing cover, be very, very gentle when you try to pry the pump off the cover. If you don't have RTV, it should just basically fall off. However, if you do have RTV gluing this thing to it, be very, very gentle trying to get that off. If you do crack the seal between the timing cover to the block, because all these bolts that hold the water pump is what holds the top part of the timing cover to the engine, you may end up having an oil leak or potentially even a coolant leak. The coolant travels through the engine block, through the timing cover, and into the water pump. So if you do break that seal, it's possible maybe the gasket will still just be fine, and when you torque everything back down, it'll just work. At 40 years old, I would say if you do end up cracking that seal, it's probably best to pull the cover and replace the gasket. In doing that, the only major step you'd have to take would be to pull this lower crank hub off, which can be difficult to do. You can see the description for the thread pitch of the crank that you'll need. To pull that off, you need a heavy-duty puller to get that off. And obviously just remove the lower bolts and the timing cover will come off. All of these engines from the factory had plastic timing, camshaft timing gears. At this age, look, if you're pulling the cover, I would recommend you just change that to a metal one anyway, and obviously a new chain and crank sprocket as well. Again, I wouldn't chase a ghost. If you're able to get this pump off without disturbing the timing cover and the car is low miles, I wouldn't even think about it. The phenolic gear on these seems to last, you know, they seem to last fairly well. These engines don't see high RPMs or anything crazy. But again, if you are taking the timing cover off and you don't want to have to do this job again anytime in the future, probably best to replace that timing gear and chain. But yeah, so we'll go ahead now, and next step will just be to take the water pump itself off the engine. I should also mention that all of these bolts thread into aluminum. This is the aluminum of the engine block, so you want to make sure, of course, if you have anything that's stuck or feels funny, don't snap them off, heat them up, or you know, get them out, penetrant oil or whatever, you know, suits your fancy. Get these bolts out without breaking anything. You'll be very glad you did. And when you reinstall, of course, good clean threads, and adhere to the torque specifications. And here is the front of the engine with the water pump removed, lightly cleaned up, pretty much ready for a new gasket to go on here. The sealing surface is still good. There's really nothing offensive about it. A little bit of corrosion, but nothing crazy. If yours is pitted or anything like that, you're definitely going to want to use RTV on these on this gasket. Otherwise, you could probably just put it on dry. Generally, these timing covers last pretty well and don't usually pit out. Here's the rest of the engine, cleaned up a little bit. Definitely not a show car, but a good working engine. So here we can see the water pump removed from the car, along with the thermostat housing. This thermostat housing is a separate part. It just pulls right off the water pump once you have it out of the car. It connects to an adapter tube that flows into the intake manifold, which I'll discuss in the next part. This is an adapter tube that allows water to flow from the intake manifold into the thermostat housing, then up through the radiator hose into the radiator. This is not a bypass tube. I've seen these things referred to as bypasses. This is not a bypass tube. Occasionally these will corrode out or pit out, in which case you'd have to replace it again. This is a 1982 to 85 HT4100 specific part. Kind of an odd design, something Cadillac, I guess, borrowed maybe from Pontiac. Pontiac used a similar setup on their V8 engine. Not really sure why they went with this. It's not the best setup here. There's not really too much to installing this. I've heard people do a lot of different things. Nothing really crazy that needs to be done. This seals with two large O-rings, one that sits in the intake manifold and one that will sit on this groove here, just on the outside. That seals it. There isn't really too much to say with this. I'll show you one that I have here as a spare part. Show you a little bit more what that looks like. There was a later service replacement part that only has one of these ridges here and uses a spring clip and a large washer that will allow you to remove the intake manifold without pulling the water pump. Those can be a little bit more tricky to install, but really this is a simple operation. You just make sure that it's fully seated into the intake manifold, in the case of this ridged original part. Make sure that it's fully seated into the intake manifold and into the thermostat housing with nice new fresh O-rings, and you should be good to go. We can see here the tube is removed from the engine. Again, this just seals with an O-ring that should be supplied with the new pump that you buy. Probably a good idea maybe just to put a little bit of white grease or something inoffensive just to help it all slide together. There are two O-rings that fit to the tube and one that fits to the bottom of the thermostat housing. So you just want to make sure that nothing is pinched or gets cut on reinstallation. Usually the way that I always put the pipe into the intake manifold first and then just screw the water pump to the engine. That seals it up just fine. Here are the three O-rings in the water pump gasket. This thinner O-ring goes to the bottom of the thermostat housing, and these other two fit to the pipe here. A note for when you do buy a new pump, you always want to get one that has this type of closed vane impeller on it. You don't want one where the vanes are exposed. This flows a good bit more water than those do. And all HT4100s had a heavy-duty cooling system from stock, so you really don't want to lose that. As an aside here, if you notice there's a bit of a flat boss here. If you have a 1982 model, this will be threaded for a fitting, and may have the fitting already installed, for a bypass tube that flows to the overflow tank. This is not really necessary. If you have an 83 to 85 car, they don't have this, and you can cap that off if your pump has that, but you should definitely try to get one that's intended for your year, so 1982 or 1983 to 85. You can adapt an 82 as well to just not have the bypass tube is really not, the bypass fitting is really not necessary. Now we'll be installing the thermostat housing onto the water pump here using this O-ring. Again, you should probably grease it up to make sure it all goes together smoothly. I would recommend that if you're going to change your thermostat, you do it while you have the thermostat housing off the car. These bolts here can be difficult to remove sometimes. This is an aluminum housing. If you break them off, obviously you're going to be in for a lot of work to replace the housing. And sometimes, even if they're not completely seized in there and they do need a little bit of breakaway torque, this thing is only mounted to the car with these two bolts here, and you can see that, especially this one, pretty long, thin mounts. So if this does get some degree of twist on it, you may end up cracking this housing. So again, if you're going to change the thermostat housing, I would take this off the car, get it firmly in a vise, and use heat if you need on these bolts to get them off. Here we can see the water pump mounted back to the engine along the thermostat housing. The 4 large bolts here, so you'll have 1, 2, 3, and 4, along with this captured, this stud with the captured nut on it, get torqued to 30 foot-pounds. The bottommost bolt on the left here gets torqued to 15 foot-pounds. These small nuts here, I would say, you know, maybe take a nut driver and put them on hand tight, plus you know, maybe a turn or a half turn. Not super sure on a spec for those. And the same here with this bolt that secures the upper end of the thermostat housing. Here we can see the water pump reinstalled with the hoses connected, as well as the crank pulley. Behind the crank pulley is the harmonic balancer, and behind that is the actual crank hub that attaches to the crankshaft. These are balanced from the factory, and you can only install them one way, so you want to make sure that the harmonic balancer holes match the crank hub, and then obviously that your crank pulley holes match the harmonic balancer. Torque on the 4 bolts that are around the perimeter here are 20 foot-pounds. In the center, you'll notice that there's a hole here. From the factory, this was plugged with a piece of cork and will not have a bolt. I do have a few of these bolts that thread into here that I usually just install in there in case you ever have to crank the engine over by hand or something in the future. Makes it easier while it's out, but not something that a car should have if you're working on it the first time. With the power steering pump pulley pressed back on and some of the belts put back on here, starting to look a little bit more like an engine. The next side that we'll tackle is the passenger side with the smog pump, alternator bracket, and alternator. So at this point, we've gone ahead and, well, I guess jumped ahead a little bit here. We have the passenger side of the engine basically reassembled. All looks like an engine again. Fan is on, belts are tensioned. A note here, if you'll notice, this belt has hardly any, this adjuster has hardly any adjustment left in it. This is a Gates 7385 belt. That's an incorrect size belt for this car. The correct belt is a 7375, but it seems like a lot of parts places stock the wrong belts for these cars. Also for the air conditioning and power steering pump belt, this is a Gates 9540. The Gates 9545 fits probably the best and is closer to the stock size belt. The Gates 9550, it's kind of hit or miss whether or not you'll be able to get enough tension on it to keep that belt from chirping under load. So for the air conditioning, Gates 9545 is probably the best overall fit. The 9540 is a little hard to get on. And for the alternator to water pump belt, the Gates 7375 is the one you want to buy. So when you go ahead and tension these belts here, you just want to always keep in mind that the and this applies really to all Cadillac V8s, definitely from 1968 forward with the big block through 1985 with this HT4100, is that the smog pump belt drives the water pump pulley, which in turn drives the alternator. So if you'll notice here, the alternator drive on the water pump is actually larger than the driven pulley by this groove on the pulley by the smog pump belt. And of course the alternator pulley is a very small diameter itself. This is to create a high RPM for the alternator so it can charge sufficiently at a low RPM. Most Cadillacs you'll see sometimes in a lesser car, When you're stopped at night and you go and hit the gas, the headlights will get much noticeably brighter. You'll never really notice that in a Cadillac, because Cadillac always did something like this to keep a high RPM on the alternator. However, in doing that, it does present a significant load on the accessory drive system. So you always want to make sure that your smog pump belt, which is of course the most difficult belt to tighten, you want to make sure that belt is nice and tight. And then of secondary importance is this belt here, the alternator to water pump. In certain circumstances where the smog pump belt is not tight, the smog pump can slip. The smog pump belt can slip on the water pump pulley when there's a large electrical load by the alternator. So sometimes people will fix this by just cranking out the alternator all the way out, and all that does is just unnecessarily load the water pump bearing. You'll see that the drive for the alternator is on the outside of the water pump pulley. So if you put a lot of load on that, it's going to cause undue wear on the accessory drive, and definitely on that water pump bearing. So as I mentioned, this is an achievable job, but it's definitely not a job you want to do often. So a good rule of thumb is you get that smog pump belt nice and taut. You tension your alternator belt. You want to make sure that when you spin the alternator by hand or using a socket, as you can see, only the alternator belt is spinning. The engine, the water pump pulley is remaining stationary, which means that smog pump belt is nice and tight. If anything, you would want this belt to be slightly looser than the smog pump belt. In an ideal world, you should be able to rotate the engine with this alternator, but in reality, it's not necessary. As an aside here, you see that this is a RC32 9-pound radiator cap. I use these caps on these cars just because they are less than the stock 15-pound system. Usually after I replace or recore the radiator, and I know that the radiator is working properly, I don't see any reason to have 15 pounds on a cooling system. It's really unnecessary. And listen, in a rear-wheel drive car, the heater core is easy to change. If you have an Eldorado or Seville, it's a nightmare. Those are inside of the car. So if you have an old heater core, you want to step down the pressure a little bit. Only 9 pounds of pressure. It's good if you have, an old gasket somewhere. I've never had a problem in thousands and thousands of miles of driving these cars with a 9-pound cap. So that's just an aside there, if you want to. Something not really necessary. And so now at this point, we can go ahead, bleed the cooling system, and check our coolant temperature, make sure that the car is operating at a normal temperature, and that we have no leaks or anything else like that, and the job should be done. Again, I will mention, just as far as this bracket here for the alternator, the bolt that sits almost in the center, just in this hole here, if you can see that does thread into aluminum. I am unsure of a certain torque value for this bracket. I would say you want it tight, but I wouldn't put undue stress on that particular bolt. Elsewise, I would just use your judgment on the torque values. There's nothing crazy here. Once you have the water pump on appropriately, that's really the critical area. The bracket, not as much. So we'll go ahead and bleed the cooling system, and we'll also check out a feature that these cars have to check the coolant temperature as you drive. A lot of people don't know that these cars actually do have a hidden coolant temperature gauge. So that'll be next. So at this point, we've gone ahead and bled the cooling system. Nothing really to even bother showing there. It's very straightforward to do. You just make sure you keep the RPMs up for a little while till the thermostat opens, and continue adding coolant until the system fills. And just keep an eye on your overflow tank level next few days after driving, just as the level equalizes. Just want to make sure you don't let it run too low. but nothing really worth showing there. So we have the car running here because it is very hot, as you can see from the outside temperature. In spite of only being 10:30 in the morning, it's 97 degrees out. So definitely want to have the air conditioning on. So in order to check the coolant temperature, the operating temperature of the car, Cadillac is built into the climate control a diagnostic system, which most people know about, that you can access by pressing off and warmer, and that will display any current or history trouble codes that haven't yet been cleared. But there's also another side to the system where you can get live engine data output from, and one of those data outputs is coolant temperature. So we'll go ahead and access that mode here. We'll start from the beginning, so I'll go ahead and turn the car off. So engine's off. Turn the ignition on. I'll just turn the air conditioning off totally. So the system is off. We'll go ahead and start the car. All right. Now the engine is on. You can do this with the engine off, but of course for coolant temperature, you'll want to have the engine on. Of course, the car is up to operating temperature by now. So we'll go ahead and press off and warmer together and hold. So the system will enter diagnostic mode. You'll see that there's no current or stored trouble codes once the system displays this .7.0. So if you have other codes, some codes will flash through here. You'll have to wait till they stop and the system settles on .7.0. If it's hot like it is today, you definitely want to keep this outside temperature indicator on. That means that the air conditioning compressor is engaged, and it's also of course valuable when you want to read your coolant temperature to have the system under as heavy of a load as it'll realistically be under. So the HVAC fan will run on low whenever you're in diagnostic mode, so as long as you have that button pressed, you'll be getting some cool air out, so that's valuable. So in order to access the data output mode, once the system is in .7.0, you'll come over to the fuel data panel and you'll press range. You'll see that it'll change to .9.0. This means that we're in the data output mode. So we can use the instant button to scroll forward, and you'll see that you have a .0 and then a number that will appear. Right? So this is the second mode. The second data output, I should say. We want to get to 4, so we'll press this again. Okay, there's 3. And there's 4. So as you can see here, we have this fluctuating number here. We're at 94, 92 and change. It's extremely hot out today, so you'd expect the temperature to be as high as realistically possible. There is misinformation out there. These cars do not operate with a 210 degree thermostat. That's incorrect. These cars have a 195 degree thermostat, just like every other fuel injected GM car, or at least GM car with an oxygen sensor. So you'll want to see a number somewhere in the neighborhood of either the high 80s or low 90s. I should mention that this number is the coolant temperature in degrees Celsius. So this at 94 degrees translates to just about 200 degrees Fahrenheit, which is normal for a 195 degree operating temperature, especially considering it's almost 100 degrees ambient. So you can drive the car around in this mode and make sure that the temperature doesn't get up too high or anything like that. You'll want to see it again somewhere around this 195 degree window, maybe plus or minus 10 degrees, given any number of outside weather factors. I will do a follow-up video on all the capabilities of the diagnostic system, because this is a very capable system that Cadillac introduced really in 1980 and then dramatically expanded in 1982 with the HT4100. So there you have it, your your water pump is reinstalled, your cooling system is bled, your belts are tensioned, and your cooling temperature is right about where it should be. So there you have it, and God willing, you won't have to do this job anytime in the future. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.